My father looked me dead in the eye and said they would be taking over my house for a 3-day beach trip. I told him I had just undergone a brutal spinal surgery and needed to recover in peace. My mother chimed in, saying their plans were not changing, and I needed to stop being selfish. When Saturday morning rolled around, they barged through my front door with their designer luggage, expecting me to quietly move to the basement. But they had no idea I was not alone. Someone was already sitting in my living room waiting for them. When my father, my mother, and my golden child sister saw who it was, the color drained completely from their faces. My name is Gwendolyn. I am 33 years old, and I work as an investment risk analyst on Wall Street. Exactly 2 days ago, I was lying on a cold operating table undergoing a complex spinal fusion surgery. My doctors had bolted sections of my lower spine together, leaving me in a heavy, rigid back brace and a state of agonizing, constant pain. I was strictly confined to a wheelchair for the first week of recovery, barely able to breathe without a sharp ache radiating through my nerves. All I wanted was to heal quietly in my own home, a multi-million-dollar beachfront property in Malibu that I had purchased entirely with my own hard-earned money. But my family has never cared about my pain. To them, I was just a convenient stepping stone. They stood there, an impenetrable wall of entitlement and arrogance. For 33 years, this was my role in the family. I was the scapegoat, the quiet worker who was expected to sacrifice my comfort, my money, and my boundaries, so that Brittany and her flashy husband could maintain their illusion of grandeur. They thought they could just barge into my sanctuary while I was wearing a back brace and force me into a basement like a piece of unwanted furniture. They expected me to cry, to argue, and ultimately to surrender to their demands. But I did not cry. I did not even raise my voice. The agonizing pain in my spine was absolutely nothing compared to the icy clarity sharpening my mind. My career in risk assessment had taught me how to spot a bad investment, and my family was the worst investment of all. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the warmth, and then I pushed the control stick on my armrest. I turned my wheelchair around to face the expansive living room area, which was slightly sunken and out of their immediate line of sight from the entryway. Actually, Terrence, I said, my voice dangerously calm and echoing slightly in the large room. You do not need to wait until this afternoon for your emergency meeting. Your investor is already here. My father, my mother, Brittany and Terrence all froze. They followed my gaze toward the plush leather sofa facing the floor-to-ceiling ocean windows. Sitting there casually sipping a shot of espresso from one of my porcelain cups was Donovan. He was a highly respected, ruthlessly sharp venture capitalist and the exact billionaire investor Terrence had been desperately trying to court for months. Donovan slowly lowered his espresso cup to the saucer with a soft, deliberate clink that pierced through the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. He did not look amused. My father's jaw dropped open. My mother's arrogant posture vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid stiffness. Brittany let out a small gasp, her perfectly manicured hand flying to cover her mouth. And Terrence, the smooth-talking visionary who had just claimed this house was his own, looked as if the floor had completely dropped out from beneath his custom leather shoes. The color drained completely from all of their faces. They had walked right into a trap they did not even know existed, and the execution was going to be absolutely flawless. The silence in my living room was absolute. You could hear the faint crash of the Malibu waves outside, but inside the air was completely stagnant. Terrence was the first to break it. He was a master of pivoting, a skill he had honed over years of faking his way through the tech industry. He smoothed the lapels of his impeccably tailored suit, a nervous habit I had documented extensively in my risk assessment files, and let out a booming theatrical laugh. "Donovan, man, what a surprise!" Terrence practically shouted, forcing a wide, charismatic smile as he took a confident step toward the leather sofa. "I told you this beach house was my little slice of paradise. I did not expect you to arrive this early. And I see you have already met Gwendolyn. My sister-in-law here is just the house sitter. She is keeping the place dusted while she recovers from a little back procedure." I watched him perform, fascinated by the sheer audacity of his delusion. Terrence had spent the last 5 years convincing my parents that he was a brilliant crypto entrepreneur on the verge of $1 billion initial public offering. My father, Richard, was completely intoxicated by the idea of having a tech mogul in the family. He loved bragging at his golf club about his son-in-law, the genius. My mother, Patricia, treated Terence like royalty, constantly comparing my quiet, steady career on Wall Street to his flashy, non-existent success. They ignored the red flags. They ignored the fact that Terence and Brittany were constantly asking for bridge loans to cover their lavish vacations and luxury cars. Donovan did not smile back. He remained perfectly still, his sharp gaze shifting from Terence to the heavy medical brace encasing my torso. I slowly reached into the side pocket of my wheelchair. The movement sent a sharp, biting pain up my spinal column, but I kept my face entirely impassive. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope and placed it deliberately on the glass coffee table. I pushed it forward with the tip of my finger. "House sitter," I asked, my voice cutting through the tension. "Terence, you are standing in my living room. You are tracking sand onto my custom hardwood floors. And you are pointing at the exact same living room that you tried to use as collateral for your $10 million Series B funding round." Terence stopped dead in his tracks. The fake smile melted off his face, leaving behind raw, undisguised panic. Brittany dropped her designer tote bag. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked, glaring at me. "Terence owns this house. He bought it for us as an investment property. He let you stay here because you were crying about your hospital bills." I let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "He told you he bought it." "Brittany, I closed on this property 2 years ago. The deed is sitting right there on the table. My name is the only one on it. But last month, someone submitted a forged collateral agreement to a private equity firm, claiming this exact address was a corporate asset belonging to Terence and his crypto startup." My father stepped forward, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Gwendolyn, shut your mouth right now. You have no idea what you are interfering with. You are going to ruin everything." "Ruin what, Dad?" I challenged, gripping the armrests of my wheelchair to anchor myself against the physical pain radiating through my fused vertebrae. "The fraud. Because walking into my house and pretending to own it in front of a venture capitalist is the definition of fraud." Patricia rushed to stand beside Terence, physically shielding him as if I were the one holding a weapon. She glared at me with the same contempt she had shown me my entire life. To her, I was always the difficult child, the one who refused to play along with the family delusions of grandeur. "Stop embarrassing the family, Gwendolyn." Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with misplaced righteous indignation. "You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of your sister and her happiness. This house is a family asset. Your father and I co-signed that collateral document for Terence because we believe in his vision. We are a family, and families share their resources to build generational wealth." I stared at my mother, genuinely astounded by the depths of her financial ignorance and blind favoritism. "You co-signed a fraudulent document. You pledged a house you do not own to secure a $10 million loan for a company that does not actually exist." "It does exist!" Terence interrupted, his voice pitching higher in desperation. He looked frantically at Donovan, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "Donovan, please do not listen to her. She is heavily medicated. The spinal surgery, you know, the painkillers make her paranoid and delusional. My company is solid. The algorithm is proprietary. The collateral paperwork was just a minor administrative error by my legal team." Donovan finally moved. He set his espresso cup down, steepled his fingers, and looked directly at my mother. His eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of sympathy. "Let me make sure I understand this perfectly," Patricia Donovan said, his deep voice carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "You are publicly admitting in front of witnesses that you and Richard knowingly signed your names to a collateral pledge for a property you do not legally own in an attempt to secure federal funding from my equity firm." Patricia puffed out her chest completely, misreading the danger in his tone. "I am admitting that we support our son-in-law, because unlike some people, he is actually going to make this family rich. We did what we had to do to get the paperwork through. It is just business." Donovan slowly turned his head, his eyes narrowing dangerously at Patricia. The silence returned, but this time it was the heavy, suffocating silence of a trap snapping entirely shut. Donovan did not break his stare. He simply pulled his phone from his tailored suit pocket, tapped the screen once, and placed it face down on the glass coffee table. The soft click of the device hitting the glass sounded like a judge's gavel. My father Richard finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. The blustering arrogance he usually carried himself with started to waver. He looked back and forth between Donovan and my mother, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Patricia, shut your mouth," he hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her back slightly. I adjusted my grip on the armrests of my wheelchair, trying to alleviate the sharp burning sensation radiating from my surgical incisions. I took a slow, deep breath, refusing to let them see me wince. "Let me clarify exactly why. Donovan is sitting in my living room today," I said, making sure my voice projected clearly across the expansive room. "Terrence, you have spent the last 5 years telling this family that you are a visionary. You used tech buzzwords to dazzle my parents, promising them generational wealth and early access to your initial public offering. But you severely underestimated how the real financial world operates." Terrence wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked very heavy and uncomfortable. "Gwendolyn, you are out of your depth here. This is high-level venture capital. It is not something a mid-level desk worker would understand." I smiled, and it was the coldest expression I had ever worn. "I am a senior investment risk analyst on Wall Street, Terrence. My firm specializes in conducting extreme due diligence for high-net-worth equity portfolios. When you approached Donovan's group asking for a $10 million capital injection, Donovan did not just look at your glossy, heavily edited pitch deck. He hired my division to tear your company apart and audit every single claim you made. And because I am the lead analyst for the technology sector, your file landed directly on my desk." Terrence took a step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the luxury rug. "You cannot do that," he stammered, his voice cracking. "That is a massive conflict of interest. We are family. You cannot legally audit my company." "Family did not stop you from trying to steal my house while I was bleeding on a surgical table," I replied smoothly. "But let us talk about your revolutionary company. Let us talk about the proprietary artificial intelligence algorithm that you claim is going to disrupt the global financial market." I looked directly at my father, who was now clutching his chest as if he might faint. "Dad, you love telling your golf buddies about Terrence and his genius coding skills. But when my team dug into the source code repository for his software, we found absolutely nothing original. There is no machine learning. There is no blockchain integration. The entire platform is built on an open-source template that Terrence literally copied and pasted from a free developer forum on the internet. A high school computer science student could have built it in a weekend." "That is a lie," Terrence shouted, pointing aggressively at me. "Our tech is in stealth mode. We are hiding the real code to protect it from corporate espionage." Donovan let out a low, dry scoff that completely destroyed Terrence's defense. "You have 0 patents filed," Terrence Donovan said, speaking for the first time since my mother's disastrous confession. "You have 0 proprietary technology. You do not even have an engineering team. Your company is nothing but a registered shell entity." I picked up the thread, immediately refusing to let them breathe. "It is a shell company designed for one specific purpose." I looked at my sister Brittany, who was staring at her husband with wide, panicked eyes. "It exists entirely to funnel seed money from gullible angel investors directly into your personal bank accounts." My mother shook her head violently, her denial kicking in as a defense mechanism. "No, no, you are making this up. Gwendolyn, you have always been hateful. Terrence has offices downtown. He has a staff. We visited his headquarters last year. He rented a shared co-working space for a single afternoon and hired a few unpaid interns to walk around carrying clipboards just to impress you." I countered, hitting her with the brutal reality. "As soon as you left, he canceled the daily lease. The seed money he raised last year did not go toward research and development. It was immediately transferred into an offshore holding account, which was then used to fund his lifestyle." Brittany suddenly lunged forward. Her perfectly styled hair bounced as her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She pointed a manicured finger right at my face, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "You are just jealous!" Brittany screamed, the veins in her neck popping. You have always been jealous of my marriage because you are a miserable single workaholic. You sit alone in this giant empty house with your boring spreadsheets, while Terrence treats me like an absolute queen. You want to destroy us because you are bitter. You know no man will ever look at you the way Terrence looks at me. You are trying to ruin my life out of pure spite. I did not flinch. I let her screaming echo off the high ceilings and fade into the background noise of the ocean. My sister had always relied on personal attacks to win arguments. She thought calling me miserable and single would break my confidence. She thought her superficial happiness was a shield against the truth. I reached back into the thick, legal-sized envelope resting on my lap. I pulled out a heavy stack of printed financial records bound together with a thick black binder clip. I tossed the stack onto the glass coffee table right next to my property deed. The heavy thud of the paper made Brittany jump. "He certainly treats you like a queen, Brittany," I said, my voice dripping with absolute authority. "But let us take a very close look at exactly whose money he has been using to do it." I tapped my finger against the top page of the financial audit, letting the sharp sound ring through the silent living room. I did not rush. I wanted them to feel the agonizing weight of every single second that passed. I looked down at the neatly highlighted rows of data that my team had meticulously verified through offshore banking records and Shell Corporation filings. "Let us start with the fourth quarter of last year," I said, keeping my tone as detached and professional as if I were delivering a quarterly earnings report to a board of directors. October 14th. A direct wire transfer of $150,000 to an exotic auto dealership in Beverly Hills. This was used to purchase a customized luxury sports car registered entirely in your name, Brittany. Brittany swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward Terrence. I flipped to the next page. November 2nd. $80,000 spent in a single afternoon across 5 different designer boutiques on Rodeo Drive for limited edition handbags and couture clothing. And my personal favorite, December 1st. A $50,000 wire transfer to cover the initiation fee for the ultra-exclusive Coastal Country Club, where you spend your weekends sipping martinis and pretending to be old money. The color was draining from Brittany's face, replacing her previous outrage with a sickening realization that her entire lifestyle was currently laid out in black and white on my coffee table. I looked right into her eyes. "Terrence did not earn the money to treat you like a queen, Brittany. He stole it from early-stage angel investors who thought they were funding a revolutionary technology company. You are driving a stolen car. You are carrying stolen handbags. You are living a completely fraudulent life." My mother, Patricia, let out a sharp, breathless gasp. But instead of turning her horror toward the man who had committed massive financial crimes, she turned her absolute fury on me. Patricia lunged forward, her face twisted with a level of hatred that I had grown entirely accustomed to over the last 3 decades. She reached across the glass table and violently slapped the stack of financial records, trying to knock the papers out of my hands. The sudden aggressive movement forced me to jerk backward in my wheelchair. A blinding flash of pain shot through my freshly fused spine, stealing the breath from my lungs, but I clamped my jaw shut and refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "Brittany deserves those things," Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical, irrational defense of her golden child. "You have no right to judge her. She suffered so much when she was younger. She could not get into a good college because we had to spend all our savings on your useless braces when you were a teenager. We sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay your sister." I stared at my mother, genuinely marveling at the boundless depths of her delusion. A harsh, involuntary laugh escaped my throat. I shook my head, gripping the cool metal of my wheelchair armrests. "Braces," I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You mean the standard orthodontic dental work you absolutely refuse to pay for?" I took on a part-time job at a local grocery store when I was 15, just to afford the monthly payment plan for my own orthodontist. I have paid for every single one of my own medical bills since the day I turned 18. I paid for this multi-million-dollar house. I even paid out of pocket for the spinal surgery I just went through because I knew this family would never lift a finger to help me. I shifted my gaze to Brittany, who was now trembling. "Brittany did not fail to get into a prestigious college because of my teeth, Mom. Brittany failed because she skipped her classes to party, and you wrote her admission essays for her. Essays which the university admissions office immediately flagged for blatant plagiarism. You have spent her entire life making excuses for her failures, and now you are making excuses for a criminal. Terence had heard enough. His smooth, charismatic facade was completely gone, replaced by the cornered, desperate energy of a man watching his entire house of cards burn to the ground. He was sweating profusely, dark patches blooming under the arms of his expensive tailored suit. He took a heavy, threatening step toward my wheelchair, his large frame towering over me. I was strapped into a rigid medical brace, entirely immobilized and physically defenseless, but I did not break eye contact. "You need to shut your mouth right now," Terence growled, leaning down so his face was only inches from mine. His fists were balled so tightly his knuckles were white. "You are going to hand over those files, and you are going to tell Donovan that this was all a misunderstanding caused by your pain medication. If you do not fix this right now, I swear to God, I will make you regret it." He reached out his heavy hand, moving aggressively toward the collar of my shirt. Donovan, who had been sitting quietly on the leather sofa the entire time, did not yell. He did not jump up. He simply raised his right hand and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen swung open. Two massive men in sharp, dark suits stepped out into the living room. They moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of highly trained private security. But they were not alone. Right behind Donovan's security detail walked three individuals wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering printed across the back. Federal agents. Terence froze, his hand suspended in midair just inches from my chest. The heavy booming sound of the ocean outside suddenly felt deafening in the dead silence of my living room. The trap had been fully sprung, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The living room instantly transformed from a stage for my family's arrogance into a trap they could not possibly escape. The three individuals in the dark windbreakers stepped fully into the natural light pouring through the ocean-facing windows. The bold yellow letters printed across their backs read FBI. The two private security guards flanked Donovan, creating an impenetrable wall of muscle, but it was the federal agents who commanded the entire room. Terence dropped his hand. His menacing posture completely evaporated, replaced by a violent full-body shudder. He stumbled backward away from my wheelchair, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the hardwood floor he had claimed to own just 20 minutes prior. Brittany let out a high, strangled gasp, pressing her back against the nearest wall, as if trying to melt right through the custom plaster. My father Richard was a man who had spent his entire 60 years of life meticulously curating his social image. He belonged to the most exclusive golf clubs, drove luxury sedans, and attended charity galas, solely to rub elbows with the local elite. He valued his pristine reputation above absolutely everything, including his own children. The moment he processed the bright yellow letters on the agents' jackets, a primal instinct for self-preservation overrode whatever fake loyalty he pretended to have for his golden son-in-law. Richard aggressively shoved Terence away, putting as much physical distance between himself and the fraudulent crypto founder as possible. "We had no idea," my father practically screamed, his voice cracking with raw panic. He pointed a trembling finger right at Terence's chest. "He tricked us. He manipulated this entire family. I am a respected man in this community. I sit on the board of the Homeowners Association. I would never commit financial fraud. He lied to us about the collateral. He lied to us about the entire company." Patricia immediately latched onto my father's cowardly defense, nodding frantically and grabbing her pearl necklace as if it could shield her from federal charges. "It is true," she cried out, looking desperately at the lead federal agent. "We are victims here. Terence told us the paperwork was just a simple formality. We only signed those property documents because we wanted to help a young entrepreneur succeed. We are completely innocent." Terence stared at my parents, his eyes wide with shock, as the people who had worshipped him just moments ago threw him directly to the wolves. I watched my parents sell out the man they had idolized without a single second of hesitation. It was a fascinating display of moral bankruptcy. I rested my hands on my lap, feeling the rigid, uncomfortable constraints of my spinal brace. But the physical discomfort was entirely masked by the overwhelming satisfaction of this precise moment. Innocent, I repeated, ensuring my voice carried over my mother's frantic pleading. That is an incredibly bold defense, Mom. But you seem to forget that I analyze risk for a living. I do not just look at balance sheets. I look at behavioral patterns, communication logs, and verifiable data. And unfortunately for both of you, your data is horribly compromised. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen to unlock it and opened my saved audio files folder. 2 days ago, I continued my gaze locking onto my father's terrified eyes. 2 days ago, I was lying in the intensive care unit. I had just undergone a massive spinal fusion. I was heavily medicated, drifting in and out of consciousness, and completely physically defenseless. You called my phone, Dad. I did not answer because I was incapable of moving my arms. It went to voicemail. But you forgot to end the call before you shoved the phone back into your pocket. You accidentally recorded a 20-minute conversation between you and Mom while you were driving to the hospital. My father's face drained of the last remaining drop of color. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the lever being pulled. I maximized the volume on my phone and synced it to the high-fidelity smart speakers installed in the ceiling of my living room. I pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. The sound of my father's car engine hummed in the background, followed instantly by his greedy, excited voice echoing from above. We just need her to be out of it for a few more days. My father's recorded voice boomed through the beach house. Terrence said, if we can secure the beach house as collateral, he will guarantee us a 20% cut of the $10 million funding round. That is $2 million, Patricia. $2 million just for signing a piece of paper. Then my mother's recorded voice chimed in, sounding completely devoid of maternal empathy. I am just worried the hospital staff will not let us into the ICU with the legal forms. We have to forge her signature quickly. She is high on painkillers anyway. If she ever finds out, we will just tell her she signed it while she was delirious. It is for the greater good. Brittany needs that money to maintain her lifestyle, and Gwendolyn never uses her money for anything important anyway. I paused the audio. The silence that followed was heavy, toxic, and absolutely devastating. The recording had stripped away every single layer of their deception, exposing the rotten, selfish core of their intentions. They had not been tricked by Terrence. They were active, willing conspirators who were eager to steal the roof over my head while my spine was literally being bolted together. I looked at Patricia, whose mouth was opening and closing like a suffocating fish. You were right about one thing, Mom, I said quietly. I did not use my money for anything you considered important. I used it to hire the best legal team in the state to forward that exact recording to the federal authorities. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, his boots heavy against the hardwood floor. He bypassed Terrence completely. He walked directly toward my parents, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Richard and Patricia, the agent, said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and identity theft. The metallic clink of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed through my living room like a gunshot. For my entire 33 years of life, my father Richard had operated under the absolute delusion that his wealth and country club memberships made him untouchable. Watching that illusion shatter was a profound experience. As the cold metal locked around his wrists, his knees practically buckled. The arrogant, booming voice he had used to order me into the basement just an hour ago was completely gone. He was reduced to a pathetic, trembling shell of a man frantically looking around the room as if expecting one of his wealthy golf buddies to suddenly appear and bail him out. But there was no one left to manipulate. Next to him, my mother. Patricia stared at the federal agent's badge as if it were a venomous snake. Her meticulously sprayed hair and expensive pearl necklace suddenly looked ridiculous against the backdrop of a federal indictment. When the second agent reached for her wrists, the reality of the situation finally pierced through her thick wall of denial. Patricia let out a guttural, theatrical wail that vibrated against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. She violently ripped her arms away from the agent and threw herself directly onto my custom hardwood floors. She collapsed onto her knees, ignoring the expensive fabric of her designer skirt, and began to crawl frantically toward my wheelchair. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup in seconds. She reached out her hands, hovering just inches from my legs, because she knew better than to actually touch my post-surgical back brace. "Gwendolyn, you cannot do this!" Patricia shrieked, weaponizing her motherhood in a desperate, hysterical frenzy. "You have to tell them to stop. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. I raised you. I sacrificed my entire youth to give you a good life. How can you sit there and send your own mother to federal prison?" "I am 58 years old, Gwendolyn. I will not survive behind bars. I will die in there. You are sentencing me to death." She gasped for air, putting on the performance of a lifetime. It was the exact same manipulative guilt trip she had used on me since I was a child. Whenever I wanted to set a boundary, whenever I asked for basic respect, she would instantly transform herself into the ultimate victim. She expected me to fold. She expected the deeply ingrained conditioning of a daughter seeking her mother's approval to override my logic and my survival instinct. But the woman sitting in the wheelchair was not a scared little girl seeking validation anymore. The woman sitting in the wheelchair had just had her spine bolted together with titanium screws, and she had spent her entire recovery period realizing that the people who shared her DNA were the greatest liabilities in her life. I looked down at her. I did not break eye contact, and I did not let a single ounce of pity soften my features. The agents paused for a brief moment, ensuring the situation remained secure, but they let me speak. "You did not raise me." "Patricia," I said, my voice dropping to a steady, freezing temperature that commanded the entire room. I articulated every single syllable with the precision of a scalpel. "You raised Brittany. You coddled, you funded her delusions, and you protected her from every single consequence she ever faced. You did not raise me. You merely tolerated my existence because I was self-sufficient. You treated me like an emergency bank account. You treated me like an unpaid consultant. You treated me like a stepping stone." Patricia sobbed louder, shaking her head in violent denial, but I refused to let her interrupt me. "You want to talk about motherhood?" I asked, leaning forward slightly despite the burning protest of my freshly operated spine. 2 days ago, I was cut open. My back was sliced apart. I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to intravenous painkillers, completely terrified and vulnerable. A real mother would have held my hand. A real mother would have made sure I was safe. But you could not even wait for the surgical anesthesia to wear off before you got into your car and started plotting how to forge my signature. You tried to steal the literal roof over my head, to fund a fake artificial intelligence company for a man who lies for a living. I gestured toward the ocean view outside my window. You walked into my sanctuary this morning and told me to go sleep in a damp basement while I was wearing a medical brace. You did not care if I suffered. You did not care if I ended up paralyzed. You only cared about securing a $2 million cut of a fraudulent investment. So do not kneel on my floor and play the victim, Patricia. The only reason you are crying right now is because you finally got caught. My words struck her like a physical blow. The hysterical sobbing abruptly stopped, replaced by a stunned, breathless silence. The mask of the loving, wronged mother completely fell away, leaving behind nothing but the terrified realization that she had absolutely zero leverage left. I had completely neutralized her emotional manipulation. The lead FBI agent stepped forward again, firmly grasping Patricia by the upper arms and hauling her to her feet. He pulled her arms behind her back, and the second pair of handcuffs clicked shut with brutal finality. "You have the right to remain silent." The agent began, his voice echoing authoritatively as he recited their Miranda rights. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the reality of federal prison set in for my parents, the atmosphere in the room shifted toward the remaining two conspirators. Brittany was pressed flat against the wall, her hands covering her face as she hyperventilated, watching her parents being read their rights. Her luxurious stolen lifestyle was evaporating right in front of her eyes. But it was Terrence who finally realized that the walls had entirely closed in. Terrence, the flashy, custom-suited fraudster who had orchestrated this entire scheme, was sweating profusely. His eyes darted wildly around the living room. He looked at Donovan, who was watching the scene with cold, calculated amusement. He looked at the federal agents who were currently securing my parents. He looked at the private security guards blocking the main entryway leading back to the street. Terrence was a 38-year-old man who had never faced a real consequence in his life. He was a smooth talker, a grifter who always found a way to charm his way out of trouble. But there was no charming his way out of a multi-million-dollar wire fraud indictment. He realized that the moment the agents finished with Richard and Patricia, he was going to be the very next person in handcuffs. Panic completely overrode his common sense. Terrence's eyes locked onto the heavy glass sliding doors at the back of my living room. The doors that opened up directly onto the expansive wooden deck leading down to the Malibu beach. Without a single word of warning, Terrence whipped around. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase, lowered his shoulder, and made a sudden, desperate dash for the back door, trying to escape. The heavy glass sliding doors at the back of my living room were slightly ajar to let in the salty ocean breeze. Terrence did not even bother trying to slide them open properly. He hit the thick glass frame with his shoulder, forcing the heavy pane along its track with a violent metallic screech that made my mother cover her ears. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase in his frantic rush. The briefcase hit the floor, popping open and spilling useless, fake financial prospectuses all over my custom rug. Terrence thought he could sprint across the expansive wooden deck, jump down to the private Malibu beach, and simply disappear into the coastline. It was the desperate, completely irrational flight response of a cornered animal. I watched him from the confines of my wheelchair, feeling the rigid support of my spinal brace, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I did not yell for him to stop. I knew he would not make it very far. The outdoor deck was constructed from premium teak wood. Because it was still relatively early in the morning, the wooden planks were coated in a fine, slick layer of coastal mist and morning dew. Terrence was wearing custom Italian leather shoes with completely smooth, polished soles. Those shoes were designed for strutting across corporate boardrooms and exclusive country clubs, not for sprinting across wet timber. From a pure risk assessment standpoint, it was a mathematical certainty that he was going to fail. Terrence made it exactly 3 steps past the threshold. His polished leather sole hit the wet wood and his feet instantly flew out from underneath him. He had absolutely zero traction. His large frame went airborne for a fraction of a second before gravity pulled him down violently. The sound of his heavy body crashing against the hard teak deck was a dull, sickening thud that echoed louder than the crashing ocean waves. He let out a sharp cry of pain, clutching his ribcage as he rolled onto his side. But before Terrence could even attempt to push himself back up to his feet, the federal agents were completely on top of him. The agents moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. They did not gently ask him to surrender. They tackled him forcefully, pressing their combined body weight directly into his back. The impact shoved his face and the front of his pristine, custom-tailored suit directly into the wet wood and the gritty sand that had blown up onto the deck overnight. The pristine, wealthy image he had meticulously crafted for 5 years was instantly destroyed in a mess of dirt, salt water, and utter humiliation. "Get your hands off me!" Terrence screamed, struggling wildly against the agents who were swiftly pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic clicking sound of a third pair of handcuffs snapping shut filled the morning air. Terrence twisted his head, spitting sand from his lips as he looked up at the agents. He immediately resorted to the only defense strategy he thought he had left. He decided to play the ultimate victim. "This is racial profiling!" Terrence shouted at the top of his lungs, his voice hoarse and desperate. "You are targeting me because I am a highly successful African-American tech founder. You cannot stand to see a black man building a billion-dollar empire. This is a setup. Gwendolyn planted fake evidence because she is a racist. I demand to call my corporate legal team right now. You are all going to lose your badges for this." I remained sitting quietly in the living room, disgusted but entirely unsurprised by his willingness to weaponize his race to cover up his massive financial crimes. Donovan slowly walked past my wheelchair and stepped outside onto the wet deck. The billionaire venture capitalist buttoned the front of his suit jacket, his expression completely devoid of any emotion. He stood directly over Terrence, looking down at the man who was currently pinned against the sandy wood by federal agents. Donovan did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, chilling authority of a man who controlled global markets. "You are not being targeted for who you are." Terrence Donovan said, his words slicing cleanly through Terrence's frantic screaming. You are not a tech genius, and you are certainly not a victim of anything other than your own boundless greed. You are being arrested today because you actively tried to steal $10 million from my private equity firm. You thought you could hand me a pitch deck filled with stolen open source code and walk away a millionaire. I have destroyed men with 10 times your intelligence for attempting much less. Terrence stopped struggling. The reality of his situation finally crushed the last remaining ounce of his bravado. He lay there on the wet deck, completely defeated, his expensive suit ruined, and his future entirely obliterated. Inside the living room, my sister Brittany was watching her husband through the open sliding doors. She had been pressed flat against the wall, hyperventilating, as she watched her luxurious stolen lifestyle evaporate. For a brief moment, I wondered if she would run out to the deck to comfort him. I wondered if she would stand by the man she had proudly flaunted to our entire family. Brittany finally moved. She pushed herself off the wall and rushed out onto the deck. But she did not reach out to comfort Terrence. She did not ask the federal agents if her husband was injured from his violent fall. Instead, Brittany stopped 2 feet away from him, her face twisting into an expression of absolute unadulterated horror. Brittany reached up and grabbed the massive, glittering diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. It was the same necklace Terrence had gifted her for their anniversary, the one she constantly bragged about on social media. Her fingers curled around the heavy stones and she pulled with sudden, violent force. The expensive metal clasp snapped, and the necklace ripped away from her skin, leaving a bright red mark on her neck. She threw the necklace directly at Terrence's face. "This is fake, is it not?" Brittany shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice carrying over the ocean breeze. She pointed a shaking finger at the jewelry resting in the dirt next to his cheek. "If your company is a total fraud, then the money is a fraud. You bought me cubic zirconia with stolen money. You let me walk around the country club wearing cheap glass. You embarrassed me." The fake diamond necklace hit the wet teak deck with a dull, hollow clatter, landing just inches from Terrence's face. The heavy stones, which Brittany had flaunted at every high society brunch for the past 6 months, were nothing but worthless glass. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy marriage was entirely shattered, laid bare in the dirt and sand right alongside her husband. But my sister Brittany was raised by Patricia and Richard. She possessed the exact same survival instincts as our parents. The moment she realized that the luxurious fantasy was over and that the federal agents were securing Terrence with handcuffs, her demeanor shifted with terrifying speed. She did not cry for her husband. She did not offer him a single word of comfort as he lay pinned against the wet wood. Instead, Brittany turned her back on Terrence completely. She faced the lead federal agent, and in a matter of seconds, she manufactured a performance worthy of an Academy Award. Her chest began to heave. Tears flooded her eyes, spilling over her designer mascara. She wrapped her arms around her own torso, shivering violently, as if she were a fragile, terrified victim, caught in a nightmare she did not understand. "Please, you have to believe me!" Brittany cried out, her voice trembling with perfect, calculated vulnerability. I had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Terrence lied to me just like he lied to my parents. I am just a wife who trusted her husband. He told me his crypto startup was legitimate. He told me the venture capital funding was real. The lead agent stood up from securing Terrence and looked at Brittany, his expression unreadable. He pulled out a small notepad. "Ma'am, your signature is listed on multiple corporate filings. You are officially registered as the chief financial officer of the company." "I did not know what those papers were," Brittany wailed, stepping closer to the agent and pressing her hands together in a pleading gesture. "Terrence is extremely controlling. He handles all of our finances. He would just put stacks of legal documents in front of me and demand that I sign them. He said it was just standard tax paperwork for his business. If I asked questions, he would get angry. He forced me to be the chief financial officer on paper. I was emotionally manipulated. I am completely innocent in all of this." It was a masterful display of toxic manipulation. She was utilizing the very real concept of financial abuse as a convenient shield to cover up her own insatiable greed. For a split second, I saw a flicker of hesitation in the agent's eyes. Brittany was highly attractive, well-spoken, and playing the role of the distressed, abused housewife flawlessly. I sat in my wheelchair, feeling the rigid, unforgiving pressure of my medical brace against my freshly operated spine. I took a slow, deep breath to manage the pain. Then I reached into the leather messenger bag, tucked securely beside my leg. I pulled out a sleek silver iPad. I had spent the last 3 weeks compiling every single piece of digital evidence my risk assessment team had uncovered during our deep dive into Terrence's fraudulent empire. I tapped the screen, entering my security passcode, and opened a highly categorized folder containing hundreds of intercepted communications. Actually, Agent, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the open sliding glass doors and slicing right through Brittany's theatrical sobbing. You might want to take a look at this before you offer my sister any tissues. The federal agent turned toward my wheelchair, stepping back inside the living room. Donovan, who was standing nearby, crossed his arms and watched me with a look of intense, quiet approval. I handed the glowing iPad directly to the lead agent. Here are the heavily encrypted emails we recovered during our cybersecurity audit, I explained, maintaining my cold, analytical tone. When my team audited Terrence's network, we found a secondary server. The device accessing that server was pinging directly from Brittany's personal laptop. In those emails, you will see that Brittany was not a victim being forced to sign paperwork in the dark. She was the primary architect of the entire money laundering operation. Brittany stopped crying instantly. Her mouth fell open and the color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking sickly pale under the California morning sun. I continued, ensuring every single person in the room heard the undeniable facts. You will find detailed correspondence showing Brittany personally setting up multiple offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. You will also see her written instructions to Terrence specifically detailing how to break down the stolen investor funds into smaller, untraceable deposits to avoid triggering federal tax reporting thresholds. She even set up fake vendor invoices, claiming the company was paying millions of dollars to a marketing consultancy firm. I looked directly at my sister, whose eyes were now wide with absolute terror. That marketing consultancy firm is registered under her maiden name. She was not just a willing participant. She orchestrated the money laundering to ensure her luxury lifestyle was fully funded before Terrence even paid his fake employees. The lead agent scrolled through the emails on the iPad. His expression hardened into a look of absolute professional disgust. He looked up from the screen and signaled to the second agent standing on the deck. "Secure her," the lead agent ordered abruptly. The reality of federal prison finally crashed down on Brittany. The pristine, untouchable bubble she had lived inside her entire life popped. Her parents could not save her. Her charm could not save her. My data had completely destroyed her only defense. Her brain simply short-circuited. Instead of submitting to the authorities or attempting to run away like her coward of a husband, Brittany directed all of her sudden primal fury entirely at me. "You ruined my life!" Brittany screamed, a guttural, terrifying sound that ripped from her throat. Her perfectly manicured facade shattered completely. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, violent rage. She bared her teeth and charged forward, her designer heels slipping slightly on the transition from the wet wooden deck to the living room floor. She lunged directly at my wheelchair, her hands outstretched like claws aiming straight for my face and my vulnerable, surgically fused spine. I did not have time to move my wheelchair backward. I braced myself for the physical impact, but Brittany never reached me. Donovan's private security guards reacted with lightning speed. As Brittany launched herself through the air, the two massive men in dark suits stepped seamlessly in front of my wheelchair. They intercepted her mid-air. The sheer physical force of their block stopped her momentum instantly. They grabbed her by the upper arms and slammed her roughly against the nearest wall, pinning her securely in place before she could lay a single finger on me. The two private security guards held Brittany firmly against the custom plaster wall of my living room. She thrashed wildly, her designer heels kicking at the empty air, but she was completely powerless against their highly trained strength. The lead federal agent walked over to her, his expression hard and unyielding. He pulled out a fourth pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp clicking sound echoed through the room once more as he locked her wrists tightly behind her back. "You have the right to remain silent." The agent told her, his voice devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. "I strongly suggest you use it." Brittany let out a high-pitched, wretched sob. Her perfectly styled hair was now a tangled, sweaty mess sticking to her face. The luxury lifestyle she thought she had secured by tearing me down and laundering stolen money was officially over. She slumped against the wall, her knees buckling as the absolute reality of a federal indictment finally crushed her arrogant spirit. I sat quietly in my wheelchair. I adjusted my posture slightly to ease the rigid pressure of my spinal brace against my lower back. The physical pain from my surgery was sharp and constant, but my mind had never felt more clear. I watched the agents gather my family together to prepare for transport. Terrence was hauled to his feet by two agents. His expensive custom-tailored suit was entirely ruined. The dark fabric was covered in wet sand, dirt, and salt water from his pathetic, desperate attempt to run across my outdoor deck. He kept his head down, staring at the floorboards, refusing to make eye contact with me, with Donovan, or with the wife he had just thrown to the wolves. Richard and Patricia were pulled up next. My father looked physically ill. His broad shoulders were slumped, and his arrogant, commanding posture was completely shattered. My mother was shaking violently. Her expensive mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks, ruining the pristine, wealthy image she worked so hard to maintain. "Move them out," the lead agent ordered, gesturing toward the front of the house. The procession began. They were marched away from the ocean views, past my imported kitchen island, and toward the heavy oak front doors of my Malibu property. I used the control stick on my wheelchair to follow them at a safe, deliberate distance. I wanted to see them walk out. I needed to watch them leave my sanctuary in exactly the condition they deserved. Donovan walked slowly beside my wheelchair, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his suit trousers. He watched the scene unfold with the detached, analytical interest of a man overseeing a successful corporate liquidation. "They really thought they could take what belongs to you," Donovan said quietly, keeping his eyes on Terrence's retreating back. "They saw your physical vulnerability and calculated that you would be an easy target. It is a fatal error in risk assessment to confuse a temporary physical injury with mental weakness." I nodded in agreement, steering my wheelchair into the grand foyer. "They have underestimated me for 33 years. Today is just the market correcting itself." As the agents pushed the front doors open, bright California morning sunlight flooded into the entryway. My beach house is located in a highly exclusive, ultra-wealthy neighborhood. The properties are spaced far apart to ensure privacy, but massive privacy hedges do not prevent human curiosity. The arrival of multiple black federal sport utility vehicles and local police cruisers with flashing red and blue lights had completely disrupted the quiet, serene Saturday morning. A substantial crowd had formed at the very edge of my manicured driveway. These were not just random bystanders. These were successful tech entrepreneurs, famous actors, and elite corporate executives taking their morning jogs or walking their purebred dogs. They stood on the sidewalk, watching the spectacle with keen, unblinking interest. The federal agents marched my family out onto the front porch. The moment the bright sunlight hit my father's face, he froze dead in his tracks. Richard had spent his entire 60 years of life absolutely desperate to be seen as a wealthy, important man. He joined expensive country clubs, leased luxury sedans he could barely afford, and constantly judged people strictly based on their bank accounts. Social status was his absolute entire identity. To my father, public perception was the only currency that actually mattered. He looked down the long driveway and saw the crowd gathered at the street. He saw the expensive athletic wear, the luxury watches, and the judging eyes of the exact social class he had always worshipped and desperately wanted to belong to. A look of sheer, unadulterated panic washed over his face. He tried to pull his arms forward to cover his face, but the steel handcuffs restricted his movement, keeping his hands locked firmly behind his back. Desperate to hide his profound shame, Richard ducked his head down into his chest. He aggressively twisted his upper body, trying to use the lapel of his suit jacket to shield his face from the staring neighbors. He shrunk down, hunching his shoulders, looking exactly like a pathetic, broken criminal rather than the proud, wealthy patriarch he always claimed to be. My mother, Patricia, reacted entirely differently. Even while wearing federal handcuffs and being escorted by armed agents, her psychological delusion remained her strongest defense mechanism. She fundamentally could not accept that her carefully crafted image of the perfect mother with the perfect family was disintegrating in public. As an agent guided her down the front steps toward the waiting federal vehicles, Patricia lifted her chin. She frantically scanned the crowd of onlookers, her eyes darting back and forth, desperately searching for a familiar face, hoping to find someone she could manipulate and spin the story to. Her eyes suddenly locked onto a woman standing near a sleek sports car parked across the street. It was Mrs. Harrington, an extremely wealthy, well-connected socialite, whom my mother had desperately tried to impress at a charity gala just 3 months ago. Patricia had spent thousands of dollars on a VIP table at that specific event solely to sit near her and climb the social ladder. Patricia planted her feet firmly on the concrete of my driveway, forcing the agent to stop walking. She looked directly at the wealthy neighbor and forced a wide, hysterical, completely unnatural smile onto her face. Mrs. Harrington, Patricia shouted, her voice shrill and echoing loudly across the quiet Malibu street. Mrs. Harrington, please do not be alarmed. This is all just a terrible misunderstanding. My son-in-law made a tiny clerical error with his business taxes. We are just going downtown to clear up some minor administrative paperwork. Everything is perfectly fine. We are a perfectly respectable family. Mrs. Harrington did not smile back. She did not offer a look of sympathy or understanding. The wealthy socialite simply reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. She held the phone up, pointed the camera directly at my mother's tear-stained, desperate face, and hit the record button. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the walls of my living room in harsh, rhythmic strokes. I stayed in my wheelchair in the grand foyer, watching through the open front doors as the convoy of federal vehicles slowly pulled out of my long driveway and merged onto the Pacific Coast Highway. Mrs. Harrington was still standing on the sidewalk, her phone held high, making sure she captured every single humiliating second of my parents and my sister being hauled away in handcuffs. The heavy oak doors were finally pulled shut by one of the remaining private security guards. The heavy, solid click of the lock engaging echoed through the grand entryway. Then there was just silence. It was a profound, heavy silence that I had not experienced since the moment my family barged into my home this morning. The screaming, the hysterical crying, the frantic desperation of cornered criminals, all of it was completely gone. The only sound left in the massive beach house was the steady, rhythmic crashing of the Malibu waves against the shoreline outside my floor-to-ceiling windows. I closed my eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline that had been flooding my system for the past hour was finally beginning to evaporate. As the chemical rush faded, the harsh reality of my recent spinal fusion surgery came roaring back. A deep, agonizing throb radiated from the titanium screws bolted into my lower back, sending sharp spikes of pain down my legs. I gripped the armrests of my wheelchair, adjusting my posture against the rigid confines of my medical brace to relieve the pressure. It hurt more than I could possibly describe, but for the first time in 33 years, my mind felt entirely light. I rolled my wheelchair back into the sunken living room. The space was a battlefield of ruined entitlement. The custom rug was scuffed with dirt and sand from where the federal agents had tackled Terrence. The fake diamond necklace Brittany had violently ripped from her own throat was still lying abandoned on the wet teak deck outside. Donovan was standing near my custom wet bar. The billionaire venture capitalist looked completely unbothered by the absolute chaos that had just unfolded. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, grabbed a crystal tumbler from the shelf, and poured himself a generous measure of 20-year-old scotch. He grabbed a second glass, filled it with sparkling mineral water and a slice of lemon, and walked over to where I was parked. He handed me the water, offering a subtle, respectful nod to my current medical condition and the heavy painkillers he knew I had to be taking. I took the glass. Donovan took a slow sip of his scotch, his sharp, calculating eyes sweeping over the quiet living room before finally settling on me. "I have worked on Wall Street for a very long time, Gwendolyn," he said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute, unfiltered respect. "I have employed hundreds of risk analysts, financial auditors, and corporate investigators. I have seen hostile takeovers and ruthless corporate dismantling. but I have never seen anything quite like what you just did. He took another sip, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Your precision is terrifying. You did not just stop a $10 million fraud. You surgically dismantled 4 people using nothing but their own greed and verifiable data. You let them build their own traps, and then you just handed them the shovels. I looked down at the sparkling water in my hand. They thought my physical vulnerability made me weak. They assumed that because my spine was broken, my mind would be compliant. They relied on the outdated notion that a daughter will always submit to her parents out of blind obligation. I just proved to them that blind obligation is the worst possible investment a person can make. Donovan chuckled, a genuine sound of appreciation. He walked over to the leather sofa and sat down, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. When you are fully healed from this surgery, Gwendolyn, I want you to leave your current firm, Donovan said, his business demeanor locking firmly into place. I want you to come work directly for my board of directors. I need someone with your exact level of ruthless analytical clarity leading my global risk assessment division. You can name your salary. You can dictate your own hours. I will give you full autonomy over the entire department. It was the kind of offer that financial analysts spend their entire lives dreaming about. Working directly for Donovan meant instant prestige, unparalleled wealth, and absolute power in the private equity sector. A week ago, before my surgery, I would have accepted the position without a single second of hesitation. But sitting in the quiet aftermath of my family's destruction, I realized that my ambitions had fundamentally shifted. I had just spent my entire morning proving that I did not need to operate under anyone else's authority ever again. I did not need my family's approval, and I certainly did not need to build someone else's empire. I looked at Donovan, holding his gaze with steady, unwavering confidence. I appreciate the offer, Donovan, I said smoothly, setting my glass down on the edge of the coffee table. It is incredibly generous, and it is a massive compliment coming from you. But I am going to have to respectfully decline. Donovan raised a single eyebrow, clearly surprised. He was not a man who was used to hearing the word no. You are turning down a blank check. I am turning down a job, I corrected him gently. Because taking down Terrence's scam did not just save your private equity firm $10 million. It provided me with the exact leverage, the high-profile case study, and the undeniable industry credibility that I needed to execute my own long-term strategy. Donovan tilted his head, his interest visibly peaking. And what exactly is your long-term strategy, Gwendolyn? I leaned back against my medical brace, allowing a small, victorious smile to finally cross my face. I am not going to work for your board of directors, Donovan, because I am opening my own independent risk assessment firm. I am going to be the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole shareholder. I am going to build a financial intelligence agency that caters exclusively to high net worth individuals who need absolute certainty before they invest. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle into the quiet room. And considering I just saved you from throwing $10 million into a fake artificial intelligence startup run by a smooth-talking con artist, I fully expect your private equity firm to be my very first official client. Donovan stared at me for a long, silent moment. The surprise on his face slowly melted away, replaced by a wide, genuine grin of absolute predatory respect. He raised his crystal tumbler of scotch in the air, gesturing toward me in a silent salute. Gwendolyn, Donovan said, his voice ringing with pure admiration. It will be an absolute pleasure doing business with you. Exactly 1 week had passed since the federal agents escorted my family out of my Malibu beach house. The toxic, suffocating energy they had brought into my home had finally evaporated, leaving behind a silence that felt both comfortable and incredibly permanent. It was Tuesday morning. I was in the center of my living room, engaged in the grueling, agonizing process of post-surgical physical therapy. My physical therapist, a no-nonsense specialist named Brenda, had just left after pushing me through 45 minutes of guided mobility exercises. I was standing on my own 2 feet. The rigid medical brace was still tightly secured around my torso, digging into my ribs and hips to keep my posture perfectly aligned, but I was no longer confined strictly to the wheelchair. The titanium screws fused into my lower spine throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. It was a stark physical reminder of the trauma my body had endured. Yet with every agonizing step I took across my custom hardwood floors, I felt a profound sense of reclamation. I was literally rebuilding my core strength step by agonizing step in the exact same room where my family had tried to break me. I poured myself a glass of ice water from the kitchen island and slowly navigated toward the leather sofa. Just as I managed to lower myself onto the cushions, bracing my back against the firm material, my cell phone buzzed loudly on the glass coffee table. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I reached out and answered it, pressing the phone to my ear. An automated robotic voice immediately filled the line. You have a prepaid call from an inmate at the Los Angeles County Correctional Facility. To accept the charges, press 1. I stared out at the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean through my floor-to-ceiling windows. I could have hung up right then. I could have rejected the charge, blocked the number, and gone back to enjoying my quiet, peaceful morning. But a part of me, the deeply analytical risk assessor who always needed to gather complete data before officially closing a file, needed to hear exactly what my father had to say after spending a week behind bars. I pressed one on the keypad. The line clicked, and the chaotic, echoing background noise of a busy county jail flooded the connection. Gwendolyn. My father's voice barked through the speaker. It was loud, demanding, and completely devoid of any warmth or remorse. It was the exact same authoritarian tone he had used to order me into the basement 7 days ago. Listen to me very carefully, Richard continued, not even bothering to ask how my spine was healing or if I was in pain. You need to contact your bank right now and authorize a wire transfer for our bail. The conditions in this place are absolutely deplorable. The food is inedible. The beds are essentially concrete slabs, and I am being forced to share a cell with actual violent criminals. I am a respected businessman, Gwendolyn. I belong at a country club, not in a federal holding facility wearing an orange jumpsuit. I took a slow sip of my ice water. I did not interrupt him. I let him dig his own grave with every entitled narcissistic word that spilled out of his mouth. Your mother is a total wreck, he complained, his voice dripping with profound irritation. She has been crying non-stop and the guards refuse to give her any of her proper skincare products. She says her cellmate is completely insane, and the public defender they assigned to us is an absolute idiot. He keeps talking about plea deals and restitution and maximum sentencing guidelines. I am not taking a plea deal. I did nothing wrong. Terrence is the one who set up the fake company. Your mother and I were just trying to secure a financial future for the family. He took a sharp breath, his tone shifting from complaining to direct commanding. You need to hire a real defense attorney for us. The best one in the city. Liquidate whatever stock portfolios you have if you need to sell your assets. I do not care what you have to do. Just get us out of here today. He paused again, attempting to deploy his ultimate weapon, his parental authority. Gwendolyn, I know you are upset about the little misunderstanding at the beach house last week. I admit the timing was not ideal given your medical procedure. But you have made your point. You called the authorities, you had your little revenge, and you threw your tantrum. Now it is time to be an adult and fix this mess. We are your parents. You owe us your loyalty. Do not let a childish grudge destroy this family. I sat there listening to the sheer, unadulterated delusion radiating through the phone line. He truly believed that attempting to forge my signature and steal my multi-million-dollar home while I was heavily medicated was just a little misunderstanding. He believed that my absolute boundary was just a childish grudge. He was fundamentally incapable of accepting accountability for his own criminal actions. I lowered the glass of water to the table. The condensation left a small ring on the glass surface. Dad, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. Let me stop you right there. I am not a frightened teenager seeking your approval anymore. I am a senior investment risk analyst. My entire career is built on evaluating the viability of assets and liabilities. When an entity asks me for capital, I look at their history, their integrity, and their potential for return on investment. And right now, looking at the data, you and Mom are nothing but massive, toxic liabilities. What is wrong with you? Richard yelled, the facade of the reasonable father instantly shattering as his temper flared. I am giving you a direct order. You will pay my bail right now, or I swear to God you will be cut out of this family forever. You will have nothing. I leaned back against my medical brace, feeling the solid support holding my spine perfectly straight. I looked out at the beautiful sunlit horizon, feeling absolutely nothing but profound peace. I did look into paying your bail, Dad, I replied smoothly, articulating every single syllable with cold mathematical precision. But my financial risk algorithm flagged you as a severe flight risk with a 100% chance of default. It is just business. I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red end call button, and blocked the correctional facility's outgoing number forever. 3 months had passed since the morning the federal agents cleared the toxic waste out of my Malibu beach house. The justice system usually moves at a glacial pace, but when you hand federal prosecutors a perfectly organized digital portfolio containing offshore bank accounts, fake corporate filings, and an audio recording of a conspiracy to commit identity theft, they tend to expedite the process. I received a formal subpoena to testify before a federal grand jury at the United States Courthouse in downtown Los Angeles. My hired car pulled up to the curb. The driver immediately moved to open the trunk to retrieve my wheelchair. I raised my hand and told him to leave it. I opened the passenger door and planted my designer heels firmly onto the concrete sidewalk. I stood up completely on my own. The grueling, agonizing daily physical therapy sessions had paid off. The titanium screws fused into my lower spine had finally settled into their permanent positions. I still wore a medical brace to keep my posture perfectly aligned, but it was a much slimmer custom-molded model that fit completely undetected beneath my tailored navy business suit. I walked up the wide concrete steps of the federal building, slowly placing each foot with absolute deliberate care. The pain that used to take my breath away had faded into a dull, manageable hum. My physical recovery perfectly mirrored the unshakable strength I felt in my mind. I was no longer the immobilized, defenseless woman my family thought they could easily exploit. I cleared the security checkpoint and navigated the sterile, echo-filled hallways until I reached the designated waiting area outside the grand jury chambers. The room was sparsely decorated, filled with rigid wooden benches and harsh fluorescent lighting. I took a seat, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly in my lap. I closed my eyes for a moment, running through the precise financial data, the transaction dates, and the routing numbers I was prepared to submit into the official federal record. The sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor pulled my attention back to the room. A man in his late 40s walked toward my bench. He wore a sharp, aggressive pinstripe suit that cost more than a decent used car, and he carried a vintage leather briefcase. He had the slick, polished look of a high-priced defense attorney who was very used to bullying witnesses into submission. He stopped directly in front of me, offering a tight, completely insincere smile. "You must be Gwendolyn," he said, his voice dripping with forced professional courtesy. "I am Carlton. I am the lead defense counsel representing your brother-in-law, Terrence, and by extension consulting with the legal teams representing your parents." I did not stand up. I did not offer my hand. I simply looked at him and waited. Carlton took my silence as an invitation to sit down on the wooden bench, positioning himself uncomfortably close to my personal space. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned in, adopting a hushed, confidential tone, as if he were a close friend offering me vital advice. "I know this entire situation has been incredibly stressful for your family." Carlton began shifting his briefcase onto his lap. "Terrence is an ambitious entrepreneur. Sometimes in the fast-paced tech industry, administrative lines get blurred. But turning this into a massive federal indictment is going to cause irreparable damage to everyone involved, including you." I stared at him, genuinely amused by his attempt to reframe a $10 million money laundering operation and an attempted real estate theft as a blurred administrative line. "Is there a legal purpose to this conversation, Carlton?" I asked, my voice as cold and hard as the marble floors beneath us. "Or are you just trying to tamper with a federal witness right outside the grand jury room?" Carlton let out a low, patronizing chuckle, holding up his hands in a defensive gesture. "Not at all, Gwendolyn. I am simply looking out for your professional reputation on Wall Street. You are a respected risk analyst. Your career relies entirely on your credibility. It would be a terrible shame to see that credibility publicly destroyed." He leaned in closer, dropping the friendly facade. His eyes turned sharp and threatening. We have reviewed the timeline of events at your beach house. You had just undergone a massive spinal fusion surgery. You were discharged from the hospital with a very heavy prescription for narcotic painkillers. I kept my posture perfectly rigid. I knew exactly where he was going with this. If you walk into those chambers today, Carlton continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, you force my hand. During the trial, I will have no choice but to subpoena your entire medical history. I will pull every single prescription pad and hospital chart. I will stand in front of a judge and paint you as a delirious, heavily medicated addict who was hallucinating a massive conspiracy because she was bitter and estranged from her loving family. I will argue that you were completely high on narcotics when you allegedly heard your father talking on that voicemail. I will make sure the jury believes that your financial audit is nothing but the paranoid obsession of a woman dealing with severe surgical trauma. He sat back, adjusting his expensive tie, letting his threat hang in the sterile air of the waiting room. You are going to look unstable, Gwendolyn, he concluded smoothly. Wall Street firms do not hire unstable, vindictive analysts who lock up their own parents. Do yourself a favor. Walk out of this building right now. Drop your testimony, claim your memory is clouded by the surgery, and let us handle this privately. It is the only way to protect your career. I looked at Carlton. I analyzed his entire strategy in a fraction of a second. It was the classic intimidation play of a defense attorney who knew he had absolutely zero financial evidence to defend his client. He could not fight the offshore bank records. He could not fight the fake open source code. His only remaining option was to destroy my character and use my physical trauma against me. I slowly reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my identification badge. I held it up so he could read the bold lettering denoting my senior status at one of the top financial institutions in the world. Carlton, I said, my voice completely devoid of fear. Do you know why I am so good at assessing risk? Because I never enter a negotiation without knowing exactly what the other side is hiding. You want to drag my medical records into court? Go ahead. The prosecutor already has my certified toxicology reports from the exact morning of the confrontation. I refused all narcotic painkillers specifically, so my mind would be clear when I dealt with my family. My blood was completely clean. Carlton's smug expression instantly vanished. The color drained from his face as he realized his entire intimidation strategy had just hit a brick wall. The heavy wooden doors to the grand jury chambers swung open. A federal prosecutor stepped out, looking directly at me. We are ready for you, Gwendolyn. I stood up from the wooden bench slowly, but with absolute terrifying stability. I looked down at Terrence's high-priced lawyer, who was now staring at me with genuine panic in his eyes. You tried to use my broken spine to scare me, I said quietly, ensuring only he could hear me. But you are about to find out that my spine is made of titanium, and I do not bend for anyone. I turned my back on him and walked straight into the grand jury room. I walked into the grand jury room that morning and delivered my testimony with absolute flawless precision. The federal indictment came down swiftly, freezing every single bank account associated with my family. But the true showdown happened a few weeks later. I found myself sitting in a stark, heavily air-conditioned conference room for a formal deposition regarding the civil asset forfeiture phase of the federal case. A certified court reporter sat at the end of the long mahogany table, her fingers poised over her stenograph machine to capture every single word spoken on the official legal record. Across from me sat Carlton, the high-priced defense attorney who had failed to intimidate me at the courthouse. Beside him sat Terrence. Without his stolen investor funds to afford custom Italian tailoring, Terrence was forced to wear a cheap, ill-fitting suit that hung awkwardly on his large frame. The arrogant, booming crypto chief executive officer was gone. He just looked like a desperate man cornered by his own lies. Carlton adjusted his tie, leaning over the table with a predatory smile. He decided to bypass the financial documents entirely and go straight for character assassination. Isn't it true, Gwendolyn, Carlton began, his voice dripping with condescension, that you have harbored a deep, lifelong resentment toward your sister Brittany? Is it not a documented fact within your family that you were intensely jealous of her marriage to my client? I sat perfectly straight in my medical brace, resting my hands calmly on the table. I am here to answer questions regarding corporate wire fraud and money laundering, I replied evenly. I am not here to discuss fabricated childhood rivalries to distract from your client's criminal indictment. Carlton smirked, thinking he had me on the defensive. But your emotional state is highly relevant to this deposition, he argued, pacing slightly. You initiated this federal investigation mere days after a traumatic spinal fusion. You were prescribed heavy narcotics. I put it to the record that your entire financial audit is nothing but a paranoid, drug-induced fantasy designed to punish a family that simply wanted to use your beach house for a weekend. Terrence nodded eagerly next to him, a smug look returning to his face. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick-bound ledger of banking data. I slid it across the mahogany table until it bumped directly against Carlton's legal pad. Let us talk about fantasies, Carlton, I said, leaning forward. Let us examine the mathematical impossibility of your client's entire business model. On page 42 of that ledger, you will find the operational expenses for Terrence's supposedly revolutionary artificial intelligence platform. Carlton frowned, glancing down at the paperwork. Terrence shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A legitimate machine learning algorithm requires massive server infrastructure and cloud computing power. I explained, looking directly into Terrence's panicked eyes. Yet the corporate bank records show absolutely zero payments to any major cloud hosting providers. You cannot train a proprietary financial algorithm on a basic consumer laptop. Furthermore, Terrence claimed his crypto trading platform was generating a guaranteed 20% monthly yield for early investors. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for maximum impact. Generating a consistent 20% yield in the current global market is mathematically impossible without triggering massive high-frequency trading alerts across international regulatory boards. I continued dissecting their defense with pure, unadulterated logic. When my team audited the blockchain ledger entries that Terrence submitted to his investors, we found that the transaction hashes were completely fake. They were manually typed into a basic spreadsheet. Your client did not build a technology empire. He built a digital Ponzi scheme using a template he bought online for $50. Carlton swallowed hard. The smug confidence completely evaporated from his face. He scrambled to look through the documents, but he was a defense attorney, not a senior financial analyst. He was entirely out of his depth, staring at columns of data that unequivocally proved his client was a fraud. Objection. Carlton stammered, his voice lacking any real authority. These financial analyses are highly subjective and require expert verification. They have been verified, I replied coldly. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Forensic Accounting Unit reviewed my methodology last week. They validated every single equation. The money your client stole did not go into research and development. It went into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to buy sports cars and country club memberships for my sister. The air in the deposition room grew suffocatingly tight. Terrence's breathing became heavy and erratic. He was watching his expensive defense strategy disintegrate into absolute dust. Carlton could not protect him from the raw, undeniable math. You are twisting the data, Terrence interrupted, his voice rising in a frantic, undisciplined panic. You do not know how my code works. It is in stealth mode. You are just a bitter, lonely woman trying to destroy a successful black man because you have nothing else in your pathetic life. Mr. Terrence, please remain quiet, Carlton hissed, grabbing his client's arm. But Terrence was completely spiraling. The humiliation of being systematically dismantled by the sister-in-law he had always treated as a disabled, invisible house sitter was too much for his fragile ego to handle. He slammed both of his large hands violently onto the mahogany table, rattling the water glasses. He leaned across the table, his face contorted with pure, unhinged rage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. You arrogant piece of trash! Terrence screamed, completely losing control of his temper in the middle of a formal legal proceeding. You think you are so smart with your little spreadsheets. When I get out of this, I am going to find you. I will have someone break your spine for real this time, and I will make sure you never walk again. The entire room froze. Carlton closed his eyes and dropped his head into his hands, looking like a man who had just watched his career go up in flames. I did not flinch. I slowly turned my head toward the court reporter sitting at the end of the table. Her fingers had been flying across the stenograph machine the entire time. "Did you get all of that on the official record?" I asked her calmly. The court reporter looked up, her eyes wide with shock, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. I turned my gaze back to Terrence, offering him a cold, victorious smile, threatening a federal witness with severe bodily harm on a certified legal transcript. That carries a mandatory consecutive prison sentence. Like I said, Terrence, you are a terrible investment. Carlton practically dragged his client out of the deposition room by the arm. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, leaving a profound ringing silence in their wake. I remained seated at the mahogany table, my posture perfectly supported by my medical brace. I looked over at the court reporter, who was still staring wide-eyed at the door where Terrence had just screamed his violent threat. I politely thanked her for ensuring the official record was absolutely accurate, gathered my financial ledgers, and walked out of the building. The immediate aftermath of that disastrous deposition triggered an absolute freefall for the defense. When a federal suspect threatens to break the spine of a primary witness on a certified court transcript, any remaining leverage they hold instantly vaporizes. My family had spent the last 3 months trying to maintain a united front, pretending they were the innocent victims of a misunderstanding. But the moment the prosecutors filed additional witness tampering and intimidation charges against Terrence, that fragile alliance completely imploded. It started with my father. Richard was a man who had spent his entire life obsessing over his public image. He valued his status, his expensive tailored suits, and his pristine golf club memberships above his own flesh and blood. The terrifying reality of spending the next 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary finally broke his arrogant spirit. He realized the ship was rapidly sinking, and he scrambled for the only lifeboat available. By Friday of that same week, Richard officially fired his shared defense counsel. He hired a private attorney who specialized exclusively in negotiating federal plea agreements. My father did not just surrender. He actively sold out his entire family to save his own skin. Richard signed a comprehensive cooperation agreement with the United States Attorney's Office in exchange for a recommendation to serve his time in a minimum security white-collar facility. He provided the prosecutors with a detailed step-by-step roadmap of the entire conspiracy. He gave them sworn testimony outlining exactly how Terrence fabricated the artificial intelligence algorithms. He surrendered emails proving that they had all knowingly engaged in wire fraud. But his betrayal went even further. Richard explicitly detailed my mother's role in the real estate scheme. He confessed to the investigators that Patricia was the primary architect behind the plan to forge my signature on the property deed while I was heavily medicated in the intensive care unit. He threw his wife of 35 years directly under the federal bus without a single ounce of hesitation. When Patricia discovered that her husband had secured a plea deal by sacrificing her freedom, her reaction was utterly explosive. My mother did not cry. She did not play the victim. She reacted with pure, unadulterated venom. Patricia retaliated with a scorched earth strategy that guaranteed mutual destruction. She immediately demanded a meeting with the lead Federal Bureau of Investigation agent assigned to the case. During that meeting, she handed over a small silver key. It belonged to a private safety deposit box located in a boutique bank downtown. Inside that box, the agents found decades' worth of hidden financial ledgers. Patricia provided undeniable proof that Richard had been systematically hiding massive amounts of taxable income in secret offshore accounts long before Terrence ever entered the picture. She ensured that if she was going to federal prison for wire fraud, Richard was going to face a secondary indictment for massive tax evasion. The loyalty among thieves was entirely dead. My parents were actively tearing each other apart, desperately trying to shave months off their impending prison sentences by exposing every single dark secret they had kept hidden during their marriage. Watching their mutual destruction from the outside was like observing a catastrophic market crash. As an investment risk analyst, I had seen corporate partnerships dissolve into bitter litigation. But seeing my own parents weaponize their marital history to destroy one another was a masterclass in moral bankruptcy. Meanwhile, my sister Brittany realized that her parents had completely abandoned her to fight their own legal battles. She also realized that her husband was facing decades behind bars, not just for the $10 million Ponzi scheme, but for explicitly threatening a federal witness. Her luxurious stolen lifestyle was gone, and she was staring down the barrel of her own indictment for orchestrating the money laundering operation in the Cayman Islands. Brittany decided to deploy her final survival tactic. She filed for an expedited emergency divorce from Terrence. She launched a frantic public relations and legal campaign hiring a desperate defense attorney using the absolute last of her non-seized assets. Brittany submitted formal declarations to the court claiming that Terrence was a tyrannical, abusive mastermind. She swore under oath that he had utilized severe emotional and financial control to force her into acting as the chief financial officer of his fake technology startup. She painted herself as a terrified, battered wife who was completely oblivious to the origin of the funds she was spending on designer handbags and sports cars. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to distance herself from the sinking ship, but the federal prosecutors were not foolish enough to believe her sudden shift in character. 2 days after Brittany filed her emergency divorce papers, I received a secure phone call from the lead prosecutor handling the case. He asked me to come down to his office in the federal building immediately. He stated that the defense had just submitted a new, highly disturbing affidavit, and he needed me to review it in person. I arrived at the prosecutor's office, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite his heavy wooden desk. My physical recovery had progressed beautifully, and I sat tall, the slim medical brace hidden neatly beneath my professional attire. The prosecutor slid a thick, bound legal document across his desk. He looked at me with an expression of profound disgust. "I need you to read the highlighted section on page 4, Gwendolyn," the prosecutor said, his tone tight with barely contained anger. "Your sister's defense team just submitted this to the judge in an attempt to secure leniency and fight the money laundering charges. We know it is a fabrication, but I need you to understand the exact narrative they are attempting to build for the jury." I pulled the document toward me. It was a sworn affidavit signed by Brittany. I scanned the legal jargon until I reached the highlighted paragraph. My eyes locked onto the words, and a cold, sharp fury instantly radiated through my chest. Brittany was no longer just claiming that she was emotionally abused by Terrence. She had completely altered her defense strategy to exploit my physical trauma. In her sworn statement, Brittany claimed that the sole motivation behind funneling the stolen investor funds was a desperate sisterly attempt to secure emergency capital. She explicitly stated that she only participated in the financial fraud because her beloved sister Gwendolyn was facing a life-threatening spinal condition and desperately needed funding for a highly experimental out-of-pocket surgical procedure. My sister was attempting to paint herself as a selfless, devoted martyr. She was looking a federal judge right in the eye and claiming that she broke the law, laundered millions of dollars, and committed wire fraud entirely to save my life and pay for my spinal fusion surgery. I slowly closed the legal document. I looked up at the prosecutor, my analytical mind instantly calculating exactly how to shatter this disgusting, blatant lie into a million irreversible pieces. I stared at the thick, bound legal document sitting on the prosecutor's heavy wooden desk. My sister, Brittany, had submitted a sworn affidavit to a federal judge claiming that she had orchestrated a $10 million money laundering operation solely to pay for my life-saving spinal fusion surgery. It was a desperate, sickening attempt to paint herself as a selfless martyr. She wanted the court to believe that her fleet of luxury sports cars, her $80,000 in designer handbags, and her $50,000 country club membership were just an unfortunate byproduct of a devoted sister trying to cover my medical bills. I looked across the desk at the lead prosecutor. He was watching me closely, waiting for my reaction. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of emotional distress. I simply opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a pristine, organized folder containing my complete financial and medical history for the past 24 months. "I do not need to submit a written denial," I told the prosecutor, sliding my folder directly on top of Brittany's fabricated affidavit. "I am a senior risk analyst. I document every single capital expenditure I make, especially when it concerns my own health care. In that folder, you will find the complete itemized billing history from the Orthopedic Surgical Center. The total cost of my spinal fusion was exactly $150,000. The prosecutor opened the folder, his eyes scanning the top document. You will see that my premium corporate health insurance covered 80% of the surgical costs. I continued, my voice cold and precise. The remaining $30,000 was paid entirely out of pocket. If you turn to the third page, you will find certified bank statements from my personal checking account. I executed a direct wire transfer to the hospital billing department 3 weeks before I even went into the operating room. My sister did not contribute a single cent to my medical care. She did not even buy me a bandage. She used my severe physical trauma as a convenient cover story for her own massive greed. The prosecutor let out a sharp, incredulous breath as he examined the irrefutable paper trail. The bank transfers matched the hospital receipts perfectly. The routing numbers aligned. The dates were verified. Brittany's entire defense strategy had just been completely obliterated by simple, undeniable math. The prosecutor assured me that this new evidence would be presented directly to the presiding judge at the upcoming hearing, effectively destroying any chance she had at claiming victimhood. 2 days later, I walked into the federal courtroom for the formal evidentiary hearing. I did not use a wheelchair. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with slow, deliberate steps, my custom medical brace holding my spine perfectly straight beneath my tailored navy suit. My physical strength had returned, mirroring the absolute, unshakable clarity in my mind. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me, sealing the room. Brittany was seated at the defense table next to her newly hired attorney. She was wearing a modest, conservative dress, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. She was desperately trying to play the role of the terrified, victimized wife and the desperate, caring sister. When I walked past her table, she refused to make eye contact, keeping her gaze firmly fixed on the wooden surface in front of her. The presiding judge, a stern older man with a reputation for handling complex white-collar crime, took his seat at the bench. He had already reviewed the financial documents I provided to the prosecution. The heavy silence in the courtroom felt incredibly suffocating as the judge looked down at Brittany's defense attorney. Counsel, the judge began, his voice echoing with absolute authority across the vast wood-paneled room. I have reviewed your client's sworn affidavit regarding her motivations for funneling stolen venture capital funds through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I have also reviewed the certified medical and financial records submitted by the prosecution. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly realizing that his client had committed blatant perjury on an official federal document. He tried to shuffle his papers, but there was no escaping the trap Brittany had set for herself. Before I make a ruling on the admissibility of this defense, the judge continued, I am going to allow the victim of this specific identity and financial manipulation to address the court. I stood up from my seat in the gallery. I walked confidently toward the podium positioned in the center of the courtroom. I adjusted the microphone, letting my eyes sweep across the room before locking my gaze entirely onto my sister. Brittany finally looked up at me. Her bottom lip was trembling. She expected me to yell. She expected me to show anger or bitterness. Instead, I delivered my statement with the freezing, calculated precision of an executioner delivering a final verdict. For my entire life, I told the court, my voice ringing loud and clear, my family has viewed my independence as a threat and my income as their personal safety net. When I required a massive, agonizing spinal fusion surgery, I funded my own recovery. I paid my own surgeons. I endured the physical trauma completely alone while my family plotted to forge my signature and steal my home. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the edges of the wooden podium. I stared straight into Brittany's terrified eyes, stripping away every single layer of her carefully constructed facade. You submitted a sworn statement claiming you laundered millions of dollars to save my life, I said, ensuring every single syllable carried the weight of absolute truth. You lied to a federal judge. You did not steal from my spine, Brittany. You stole to buy a spine for yourself because you never had the courage to work a single day in your entire life. You wanted the luxury and the prestige of a wealthy socialite, but you were completely unwilling to earn it. So you partnered with a fraudster. You stole from innocent investors, and when you finally got caught, you tried to use my broken back as a shield. Brittany let out a loud, pathetic sob, covering her face with her hands. Her defense attorney put a hand on her shoulder, but it was far too late for damage control. She was thoroughly exposed. I stepped away from the podium and walked back to my seat. I did not look back at her. The judge stared down at the defense table from his elevated bench. His expression was a portrait of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at the pristine financial receipts I had provided, and then he looked at Brittany, who was currently weeping loudly in a desperate final attempt to garner sympathy. Your attempt to weaponize a family member's severe medical trauma to justify massive corporate fraud is one of the most abhorrent defense strategies I have ever witnessed in my courtroom, the judge stated, his voice laced with profound contempt. He picked up the sworn affidavit and tossed it dismissively onto his desk, setting the stage for a merciless sentencing. The federal courtroom was packed to absolute capacity on the morning of the final sentencing. The heavy mahogany doors were guarded by federal marshals maintaining strict order. The gallery behind me was not filled with curious onlookers or supportive family members. It was a sea of defrauded investors. There were retired couples who had lost their life savings, eager young venture capitalists whose careers had been severely damaged, and small business owners who had trusted Terrence with their hard-earned capital. The sheer volume of financial devastation in that room was a living, breathing testament to the absolute recklessness of my family's greed. I sat in the very first row directly behind the prosecution table. My custom medical brace held my spine in perfect, rigid alignment. The physical pain from my surgery was now a distant, manageable ache entirely overshadowed by the profound, icy clarity of the moment. I watched as the bailiff led the defendants into the courtroom from the federal holding cells. Terrence walked in first. The flashy custom-tailored suits he used to parade around my Malibu beach house were completely gone. He was wearing a standard, shapeless, khaki federal prison uniform. His wrists and ankles were bound in heavy transport chains. The arrogant, booming crypto chief executive officer had been entirely erased. He kept his head bowed, his eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards, refusing to look at the dozens of investors sitting directly behind me who were whispering angrily at the sight of him. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were escorted in next. They had been allowed to change into civilian clothing for the sentencing, but the expensive designer labels could not hide how drastically they had deteriorated. My father, who had spent his entire 60 years demanding respect and chasing social status, looked small, frail, and terrified. His shoulders were slumped. My mother was trembling uncontrollably, her eyes darting around the packed courtroom like a trapped animal. They looked thoroughly defeated, but I knew from 33 years of experience that they still believed their privilege would somehow save them at the very last second. The presiding judge struck his gavel, bringing the chaotic room to an immediate ringing silence. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defense table with an expression of absolute, unfiltered contempt. He addressed Terrence first. The judge did not mince his words. He systematically broke down the sheer audacity of the $10 million wire fraud operation. He detailed how Terrence had fabricated the artificial intelligence algorithm, mocked the fake open-source code, and highlighted the egregious transfer of seed money into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. "You did not build a technology company," the judge stated, his voice echoing powerfully across the wood-paneled room. "You built an elaborate illusion designed to siphon millions of dollars from innocent people to fund a lifestyle of grotesque luxury. But what the court finds most deeply disturbing is your conduct after the fraud was exposed. You did not show remorse. Instead, you explicitly threatened a federal witness, threatening to break her spine on an official court transcript. That demonstrates a level of malice that this court simply will not tolerate." Terrence opened his mouth perhaps to offer a desperate apology, but the judge raised his hand, silencing him instantly. "For the charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and witness intimidation," the judge declared, "I sentence you to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary to be followed by 5 years of supervised release. You are also ordered to pay full restitution to every single investor you defrauded." A collective gasp of relief swept through the gallery of investors. Terrence squeezed his eyes shut as the reality of a decade and a half behind bars finally crushed him. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward and guided him back toward the holding cells. Then the judge turned his piercing gaze directly toward my parents. Richard and Patricia stood up. Their private defense attorney stepped forward to the podium. He launched into a meticulously rehearsed plea for extreme leniency. The lawyer cited my parents' advanced ages, noting that Richard was 60 and Patricia was 58. He emphasized that they had zero prior criminal convictions. He talked about their long-standing reputation in the community, their charitable donations, and their supposedly fragile health. The defense attorney confidently requested a sentence of probation, or at most, a brief period of monitored house arrest. My parents nodded along, a faint glimmer of hope returning to their pale faces. They genuinely expected the judge to look at their gray hair, their country club appearance, and give them a simple slap on the wrist. They believed the justice system would treat them as naive elderly victims who had just been misled by their son-in-law. The judge let the defense attorney finish his plea. He folded his hands on his desk and looked directly into my father's eyes. Your counsel has asked this court to consider your age and your lack of a criminal record. The judge began, his tone deceptively calm. He has asked me to view you as respectable citizens who made a single unfortunate error in judgment. But I have read the prosecution's brief. I have listened to the audio recordings. I have reviewed the medical records submitted by your own daughter. The glimmer of hope on my parents' faces instantly vanished. You are not naive victims. The judge continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity, hammering into them like physical blows. You are calculated, ruthless opportunists. Your daughter was lying in an intensive care unit recovering from a massive, agonizing spinal fusion surgery. She was heavily medicated and completely physically defenseless. And instead of offering her care, you conspired to forge her signature. You plotted to steal her home. You explicitly planned to leverage her severe medical trauma to secure a $2 million cut of a fraudulent investment. My mother let out a small, terrified whimper, covering her mouth with her hands. My father grabbed the edge of the defense table to keep his knees from buckling. Age and privilege do not excuse profound moral bankruptcy, the judge stated, delivering the final devastating blow. The fact that you were willing to exploit your own incapacitated daughter for financial gain makes your participation in this conspiracy uniquely abhorrent. This court will not grant you leniency. The judge picked up his gavel. For conspiracy to commit wire fraud and attempted identity theft, I sentence both of you to 7 years in federal prison. 6 months after the gavel fell in that federal courtroom, I stood on the edge of my outdoor deck, breathing in the crisp, salty air of the Pacific Ocean. I was not wearing my rigid medical brace. I was not gripping the armrests of a wheelchair. I stood perfectly tall, my bare feet planted firmly on the smooth, polished teak wood. The titanium screws fused into my lower spine were no longer a source of agonizing, paralyzing pain. They had completely integrated into my body, becoming a permanent, unshakable foundation. I had spent half a year pushing through grueling physical therapy, refusing to let my body remain broken, just as I had refused to let my family break my spirit. The Malibu beach house was completely transformed. The morning after my parents and sister were sentenced to federal prison, I hired a premier architectural firm to completely gut the main living areas. I wanted absolutely zero physical reminders of the toxic entitlement that had polluted my sanctuary. The custom rug where Terrence had dropped his fake financial prospectuses was incinerated. The glass coffee table where my mother had violently slapped my audit reports was replaced with a stunning, solid slab of black marble. The dark, heavy curtains were stripped away, allowing maximum natural sunlight to flood the open concept space. The house was no longer just a luxury property. It was a physical manifestation of my absolute independence. It was my fortress. My physical recovery perfectly mirrored the aggressive expansion of my professional empire. I kept the promise I made to Donovan on the day of the arrests. I officially submitted my resignation to my former Wall Street employer and launched my own independent financial intelligence agency. I secured a sleek, high-security office suite in the financial district of Los Angeles, catering exclusively to high-net-worth individuals who required absolute, undeniable certainty before allocating their capital. I built a team of the sharpest forensic accountants and cybersecurity experts in the industry. At 10 o'clock that morning, the heavy glass doors of my new corner office swung open. Donovan walked in wearing his usual impeccably tailored suit, projecting the quiet, predatory confidence of a billionaire venture capitalist. He bypassed the seating area and walked directly to my custom mahogany desk. He did not offer a handshake. He slid a thick leather-bound contract across the polished wood. "I told you I would be your first official client," Donovan said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute professional respect. "My board of directors unanimously approved the retainer. From this moment forward, my private equity firm does not authorize a single wire transfer over $5 million unless your agency conducts the risk assessment and clears the target entity. You have full auditing authority over our entire Western portfolio." I picked up my customized fountain pen, feeling the cool, heavy metal between my fingers. I flipped to the signature page of the massive contract. Securing Donovan's equity firm as my anchor client guaranteed my new agency millions of dollars in annual revenue. It was a massive industry-shaking move that immediately positioned my firm as a premier player in the financial sector. I signed my name with smooth, calculated precision. I slid the contract back across the desk. "I look forward to protecting your capital, Donovan," I replied, my voice steady and commanding. "My algorithms are already actively scanning your pending acquisitions. I will have a comprehensive threat analysis on your desk by Friday morning." Donovan offered a sharp, satisfied smile. He picked up the contract. "I have absolutely no doubt you will, Gwendolyn. You are the most terrifyingly precise analyst I have ever met. I pity anyone foolish enough to try and hide their liabilities from you." He turned and walked out of my office, leaving me alone with the quiet, humming energy of a multi-million-dollar enterprise that I had built entirely from the ground up. I did not rely on family connections. I did not inherit a single dime. I constructed my empire using nothing but raw intelligence, unyielding boundaries, and a refusal to be a victim. Later that afternoon, I drove my sleek, newly purchased luxury sedan up the winding, scenic route of the Pacific Coast Highway, heading back to my Malibu fortress. The California sun was beginning its slow descent, casting brilliant streaks of orange and gold across the ocean water. I pulled into my long private driveway parking near the front entrance. I walked to the heavy steel mailbox positioned near the security gate, retrieving the daily stack of correspondence. Most of it was standard corporate mail. There were thick envelopes containing embossed invitations to exclusive charity, galas, financial prospectuses from prospective clients begging for my auditing services, and legal documents regarding my business expansion. I flipped through the pristine white envelopes as I walked through my front door, enjoying the quiet, secure atmosphere of my home. But as I reached the bottom of the stack, my hands suddenly stopped moving. Tucked beneath a glossy magazine was a cheap, thin, off-white envelope. The paper was rough and poor quality. The postage was not a standard stamp, but a pre-printed mark indicating it had been processed through the federal penitentiary mail system. I stared at the return address stamped in bold, stark black ink in the upper left corner. It listed the exact name and location of the minimum security federal correctional institution, where my father was currently serving his 7-year sentence for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and attempted identity theft. Beneath the prison stamp, written in hurried, desperate, and incredibly familiar handwriting, was my name. It was my father's handwriting. The same arrogant, sweeping cursive he used to sign the fake collateral documents for my house. I stood perfectly still in my grand foyer. The air in the house suddenly felt heavy. I ran my thumb over the rough edge of the cheap prison envelope. My father, the man who had ordered me to sleep in a damp basement while I was wearing a spinal brace, the man who had completely sold out his own wife and daughter to save his own skin, was reaching out to me from behind bars. He was breaking the silence of his federal incarceration, desperate to re-establish contact with the daughter he had publicly disowned. I did not open it immediately. I knew exactly what kind of manipulative, guilt-inducing poison was waiting inside those folded pieces of cheap paper. I was going to beg for a second chance. He was going to try and weaponize his age and his misery to crawl his way back into my financial good graces. The final desperate play of a completely ruined man. I carried the thin, cheap prison envelope into my newly remodeled kitchen. The solid slab of black marble on the island felt cool beneath my fingertips. I set the envelope down next to a vase of fresh white orchids. It looked like a piece of trash that had accidentally blown in from the street. I could have thrown it directly into the incinerator chute. I could have tossed it into the recycling bin without a second thought. But I am an analyst to my core. I do not ignore incoming data, even when I know the source is entirely corrupted. I opened the top drawer, retrieved a heavy silver letter opener, and sliced through the cheap paper seal. I pulled out a single sheet of lined yellow legal paper. The handwriting was cramped, completely stripped of the sweeping, arrogant flourishes my father used to project when he was signing fraudulent real estate documents. "My dear Gwendolyn," the letter began. The fake affection made my stomach turn. "I have been sitting in this concrete cell for 6 months, and the conditions are absolutely inhumane for a man of my standing. My back is failing. The food is practically poison. I know we had our disagreements regarding the beach house, but surely you can see that a 7-year sentence is a draconian overreaction by a vindictive judge." I read the words, marveling at his absolute inability to grasp reality. He still viewed his massive federal wire fraud conviction as a simple disagreement. He still believed he was a victim of the justice system rather than the architect of his own destruction. He continued, "Your mother is useless to me now, and Terrence completely ruined this family. You are the only successful one left, Gwendolyn. Family duty requires us to stand together during hardship. I need you to wire funds to my commissary account immediately. I also need you to retain a federal appeals attorney to overturn this ridiculous sentence. We are blood. You owe me this second chance. Do the right thing." I placed the yellow paper flat on the black marble island. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I did not feel the familiar heavy burden of a daughter desperately trying to earn her father's love. The toxic conditioning that had governed the first 33 years of my life was entirely gone. Looking at his letter was like reading a terrible pitch deck from a bankrupt startup. He offered absolutely zero accountability. He demonstrated zero emotional growth. He was simply trying to leverage a biological connection to secure emergency funding for his own personal comfort. It was the exact same parasitic behavior he had enabled in Brittany for decades. He wanted me to act as his personal bank account, just as he had always intended. I picked up my customized fountain pen. It was the exact same heavy metal pen I had just used to sign a multi-million-dollar risk assessment contract with Donovan. I folded the yellow legal paper and shoved it back inside the cheap federal envelope. I did not write a long, emotional response. I did not waste my valuable time explaining exactly why he was going to rot in that minimum security facility for the next 7 years. I did not tell him how spectacular my new company was doing, or how beautifully my spine had healed. He did not deserve my anger, and he certainly did not deserve an update on my life. I uncapped my pen. I pressed the gold nib against the front of the envelope, right over his cramped, desperate handwriting. With smooth, bold, unapologetic strokes, I wrote a single, undeniable directive across the rough paper. "Return to sender. No longer at this address." I capped my pen and set it down. But the physical action of rejecting his letter was only the first step. I needed to ensure that my fortress was completely impenetrable on every possible front. I walked into my home office, my footsteps silent against the premium hardwood floors. I opened my encrypted laptop and navigated directly to the official communication portal for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I logged into the system using the administrative credentials I had verified through my legal team months ago. I typed in Richard's specific inmate identification number. I navigated to the contact restrictions panel and permanently blocked his ability to send mail, initiate phone calls, or route electronic messages to my address and phone number. I did not stop there. I entered Patricia's inmate number and blocked her completely. Finally, I entered Terrence's maximum security identification number and severed his access to me forever. With 3 simple clicks of my mouse, I legally and digitally eradicated my biological family from my existence. The system confirmed the permanent communication block with a bright green checkmark on my screen. They were completely shut out in the dark, left to rot in the consequences of their own boundless greed. I closed my laptop. The sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting a warm, brilliant glow over the Pacific Ocean. I picked up the defaced envelope from the kitchen island and walked out of my heavy oak front doors. The evening air was crisp and clean. I walked down my long private driveway, feeling the solid, painless stability of my fused spine supporting every confident stride. I was no longer trapped in a wheelchair. I was no longer trapped by their manipulation. I reached the heavy steel mailbox at the edge of my security gate. I pulled open the metal slot. I dropped the envelope inside, letting it fall into the outgoing mail tray with a soft, definitive thud. I closed the mailbox securely. The physical action symbolized the complete, irreversible cutting of the toxic umbilical cord that had strangled me for decades. I was finally utterly untouchable. I turned away from the heavy steel mailbox and walked back up my long private driveway. The California evening had settled into a perfect breezy dusk. As I approached my house, the sound of the crashing ocean waves was joined by a sound I had not heard in this space for a very long time. It was the sound of genuine, unfiltered laughter. I had arranged a private barbecue on my expansive outdoor deck to celebrate the highly successful first quarter of my independent financial intelligence agency. The same teak wood deck, where my brother-in-law had desperately tried to flee from federal agents, was now illuminated by warm, glowing string lights. A private chef I had hired for the evening was turning premium cuts of steak on a massive stainless steel grill, filling the salty ocean air with an incredible rich aroma. My home was no longer a battleground. It was a fortress filled exclusively with people who had earned their place in my life through mutual respect, unwavering support, and professional integrity. I walked through the open glass sliding doors and stepped out onto the deck. My physical therapist, Brenda, was standing near the outdoor fire pit, laughing loudly at a joke told by Michael, the brilliant lead cybersecurity expert I had poached from a top tech firm to run my digital audits. Standing near the custom outdoor bar was David, my senior forensic accountant, who was deep in a conversation with Donovan. Donovan caught my eye as I walked over to join them. The billionaire venture capitalist was holding a bottle of high-end sparkling water, completely relaxed, leaving his usual ruthless boardroom demeanor behind. I was just telling David here that your agency is officially making my life far too easy, Donovan said, offering a rare, genuine smile. We ran 3 major acquisition targets through your risk assessment algorithm this week. You flagged 2 of them for hidden liabilities before my own legal team even finished reading the executive summaries. You are saving my private equity firm a massive amount of capital, Gwendolyn. I grabbed a glass of iced lemon water from the bar and offered a slight acknowledging nod. I told you I would protect your assets, Donovan. When you strip away the flashy presentations and the aggressive corporate charm, the raw financial data always tells the absolute truth. People lie. Numbers do not. Donovan raised his glass toward me in a silent, respectful toast. To the absolute truth, he said, taking a sip. I left them to their conversation and slowly walked toward the far edge of the wooden deck. I leaned against the sturdy glass railing, looking out at the vast, dark expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The moonlight reflected off the rolling water, creating a beautiful, shimmering pathway across the surface. I stood perfectly tall. I did not need a wheelchair. I did not need a rigid medical brace digging into my ribs. The titanium screws fused into my lower spine felt completely integrated into my body. There was no more agonizing pain shooting down my legs. There was only the solid, undeniable strength of a body and a mind that had entirely healed. I took a deep breath of the cool ocean air and let myself reflect on the sheer magnitude of the journey I had just conquered. Just a few months ago, I was lying in an intensive care unit, heavily medicated and completely physically defenseless. I was the family scapegoat, the quiet 33-year-old investment risk analyst who was expected to sacrifice my home, my finances, and my boundaries to fund the delusions of my golden child sister and her fraudulent husband. My parents had looked at my broken back and saw nothing but a convenient opportunity to forge my signature and steal the roof over my head. They had barged into this exact house, demanding that I sleep in a damp basement storage room while they entertained a billionaire with stolen money. They thought they could use my trauma to secure their own unearned wealth. They thought the ingrained toxic conditioning of family duty would keep me silent and compliant. But they severely miscalculated the risk. I did not have to scream. I did not have to throw a hysterical tantrum like my mother or launch a violent physical attack like my sister. I simply took the financial evidence my team had meticulously gathered and placed it directly into the hands of federal authorities. I watched my family tear each other apart in deposition rooms and federal courthouses, completely destroying their own lives with their boundless greed, their breathtaking arrogance, and their absolute moral bankruptcy. My father was sitting in a federal prison cell because his obsession with social status blinded him to his own daughter's worth. My mother was locked away because she chose to enable a criminal rather than protect her own flesh and blood. Brittany was serving time because she wanted a luxury lifestyle she was entirely unwilling to work for. And Terrence was facing 15 years behind bars because he thought a cheap, fake artificial intelligence template could outsmart a Wall Street risk analyst. I had dismantled a $10 million fraud ring and eradicated my toxic family without breaking a single drop of sweat. I turned my head slightly, looking back at the warm, glowing lights of my deck. I watched my loyal friends and my brilliant colleagues enjoying the beautiful California night. This was the family I had chosen. This was the empire I had built entirely on my own terms. I looked back out at the endless, powerful ocean, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of peace settle permanently into my bones. They thought they could walk all over me because I was healing. They didn't realize that while my spine was broken, my mind was sharper than ever. Sweet revenge isn't about destroying people. It's about letting them destroy themselves while you build an empire on the high ground. The greatest lesson I learned is that true strength is recognizing your own worth. For years, I allowed toxic family dynamics to dictate my value, believing blood tied me to their abuse. Lying in my medical brace, I finally realized that setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of survival. We never owe our peace to people who only view us as resources to exploit. You hold the absolute power to permanently evict those who attempt to break you. Share how you cut toxic ties to protect your inner peace, and please comment below.